Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on YouTube Live. My name is Cheryl Jennison DeProza, and today I'm joined by Jim Allen and Laura Davidson, and they're going to be talking us through some live sound mixing terms to really just give us sort of some info on how we can talk about our sound and how we can best, inform the things that we want to do to make our sound better. Before we get into that, just a few items to note. As you can tell, we are coming to you from our homes, so if we run into any sort of technical glitches or anything like that, please be patient. We will work through them as best as we can. I promise you we've rehearsed this, so I don't think we should run into anything, but if we do, just be patient and we will get this information to you. And then second of all, if you have any questions today, please type those in the comments section. We'll be watching that and answering most of those questions at the end of the session. So type in your comments, I'll be making note of them, and I'll present them to the team at the end of the session. That's enough for the housekeeping. Let's get into the learning. Take it away, Laura and Jim.
Thank you, Cheryl, and welcome everybody. We are excited to walk you through some terms that you may have heard a million times, but have no idea what they actually mean. And so we get to take you through that and dive in. Jim's going to give you an overview. I'm just going to switch over here so we can see what we're going to talk about. We are going to go through the audio frequency spectrum to just give you kind of a visual representation of what you're physically hearing when you're listening to audio. And we're going to go through some of the overview of signal processing tools so that you can learn how to correct certain audio deficiencies, we'll call them, or inefficiencies. And then Jim's going to go through the actual terminology with some examples so you can hear the difference and then clean them up at the end. So it's going to be demo mode. So that's why it's so important to be monitoring with headphones so that you can hear these examples, because Jim worked real hard to make those become a reality. Right, Jim? Super hard.
I worked so hard. I haven't slept in months.
He hasn't. It's been really demanding. So so that's what we're here to talk about. And we want this to be interactive. So we look forward to seeing your comments come flying in. And we want you to take something away from this, we hope. So Jim, I think we can just start talking about the real good stuff here. So audio frequency spectrum. The meat and potatoes. The meat and potatoes, if you will. Right. So if you've seen one of these lovely graphs before, which if you've looked at any sort of audio manual or bought a Shure microphone, for example, and looked in there, you may have seen this frequency curve. And this is kind of the overview of the frequency spectrum. So the human ear is sensitive to frequencies from 20 to 20,000 hertz, or 20K if you're keeping track. So looking at that graph, you can see that wide spectrum there. And I believe this is actually, is this the frequency response from the SM58, Jim? I can't remember, but I think so.
That's what it looks like.
It sure does. So base frequencies kind of live on that left side of the graphic that you're seeing there from 20 to 250, and mid from 500 to 2K, and then high frequencies from 4K to 10K. So when you hear people say, let's roll off a little 2K, that's what they're talking about. So we want to know what kind of listeners and attendees we have here today. How are you going to use this technology? Are you a performer yourself? Are you an audio engineer? Are you hoping that performers will learn how to speak your language? We want to know what you're kind of going for here. So, and that human voice range, you can see down on the bottom, the range there, and what we refer to as intelligibility. So that's just kind of a big picture overview here, but to put it more in context for you, here's how some different instruments and different things play into that frequency range, again, separated by the bass, mid, and high. And you can see here where the different vocal ranges would fall, some percussion instruments, woodwinds landing in kind of that mid-range. So if you're visual like me and you like to see, okay, great, how do I actually apply this to the real world? You can see things like the piano and the organ kind of run the full gamut, whereas you have something like bass drum, which lives down in that lower range. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, but you may have heard terms that have gone through and said things like, and grab those headphones now. But if you've heard things like crunchy, my tone sounds too crunchy. It sounds boomy, muddy, boxy, honky, bright, or crispy. That's just a sample of the terms that people tend to use that nobody has an idea of what they're actually talking about. So this is just the sample that we're going to cover. And so Jim's going to go through and give you some examples of what those sound like and why they sound that way. And then again, how he's going to work some magic to correct them. So Jim, you ready for all this?
Yeah. So Laura put together a nice recording of her playing acoustic guitar. She is a talented musician and vocalist. Before I start playing it, Laura, you want to tell us how you recorded it?
Yeah, so I recorded it using a KSM 137 pencil condenser microphone in my room that I'm in right now. So it's very not acoustically friendly typically, but for this particular example, I was able to use that directional mic, and the KSM 137 let me capture all the details. So it's just an acoustic Taylor, and it's a wide variety dynamic piece from quiet kind of palm muted strumming to a wide open strum in drop D.
Nice. Okay, so the one thing to get out of the way is these terms, they're completely subjective, and we really want to hit home that we're talking about different portions of the spectrum, what you hear audibly, and basically these words are a good starting point to cover certain ranges, like crunchy. Well, not crunchy. That's not as much of a tonal imbalance versus like boomy and muddy and things like that. But we'll start with crunchy. So here, the way I'm gonna do this is I'm gonna play the track just so you can get an idea of what it sounds like without any processing. And then I'll go in and give you the example between crunchy and clean and then boomy and clean. You'll get the gist. So just listen carefully, close your eyes if there's distracting things going on around you. The whole idea about this is using your ears. That's very important. So just listen carefully. Okay, so hopefully you heard those variations. Crunchy becomes distorted really quick. I'll give you a good visual on what actually happens when something is becoming distorted. We're probably clipping something in the audio chain, and it usually sounds, pretty brutal. And this, you're hearing a digital distortion here, so it can sound a little bit different between analog and digital equipment. So it's the easiest thing to fix too. Usually you just turn down the preamp or find where you're overdriving it in the signal path and compensate using attenuation, or just turn down the preamp. Next, we'll go to boomy, and going forward, these are going to be more tonal issues or ways to describe a sound that you are trying to say, like, oh, this sounds boomy. So boomy, in reality, we say boomy, but we're talking about 100 hertz to 200 hertz. So let's just go ahead and give that a listen 1 second. And again, I'll be going between clean and a boomy sound.
That's boomy.
Let's just go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll just let it play in the background here. Hopefully you can hear me all right. We're going to go to muddy now. Now you'll probably hear muddy and boomy used interchangeably. They both cover pretty low portions of the audible spectrum. So muddy, I guess you could consider a little bit higher, but sometimes you can use those interchangeably. So Boomy and Muddy covered the bass frequencies like we discussed earlier. So the portion of the spectrum that you'd hear like kick drums and explosions in movies and stuff in. When there's too much presence in the bass frequencies, you end up with a muddy or a boomy sounding tone, which you can use. All of these you could use different EQ filters, which we'll talk about in a bit, to fix. So let's go on to the next one. We'll start out clean, and then boxy we're kind of hitting the mid frequency range here with boxy versus muddy and boomy. So 400 hertz to 600 hertz, more specifically, eventually when you get used to talking about these terms, we'll shift towards using frequencies because that's much easier to communicate with somebody versus a subjective term like boxy. But we all got to start somewhere.
Let us know if you're not hearing the difference in the chat, but it should be pretty apparent.
Now, we made these pretty apparent for the most part. So you get into the point where it's not always going to be this obvious if you're mixing or you're working with an engineer to work on a mix. So sometimes it might be more subtle. That's why it's really you got to be really focused on using your ears when you're listening to these things.
That's boxy. Boxy. Clean. Oh, that's very boxy. Oh boy.
All right, so let's just keep moving on up through the audible spectrum here. So there's different words sometimes. You'll hear it called nasally, sometimes you'll hear it called honky, but both those words are kind of covering the mid-range. So 600 hertz to 1 kilohertz is what we're more focusing on here. And yeah, sometimes I think a good you know what, never mind. Let's just continue listening to these tracks. Okay, so nasally, honky, boxy to cover more of the mid-range. Now we're gonna move more up into the higher frequencies, or like you'll also hear it referred to as the treble and things like that. So it's 1.5 to 6K. We're gonna cover a lot of terms here. So bright or edgy or harsh. You've probably heard these used before, even interchangeably. So this is be like the upper mids and high frequencies. Now, this might be more obvious if you're listening close than the mid-range examples we had earlier. So I won't judge you if you have to turn your headphones down.
Watch your ears, people.
Exactly. Thank you. 1 second. Okay, starting out clean.
Oh, yeah. Where did it go? Too bright.
Another term, this one particular, another term I didn't list here would be thin.
That's so thin. Yikes. Sounds better.
When we're using that example, you can really, when it goes to the bright, you can hear like the strumming, like the pick hitting the strings a lot more when the mid and low frequencies aren't there.
Oof.
Yeah. Okay, we got one more brutal one. So this next one, crispy. I really like that term, crispy, or even sibilant, and we're 6 to 10K. And this is where we're going to top it out. I'll talk about this in a second, but above 10K, it's going to sound similar. And believe it or not, while a lot of things go all the way up to 20K, a lot of people can't hear up to 20K. So those changes might be really difficult for some people to hear, or even any program with that information might be difficult for some individuals to hear.
And don't forget, Jim's going to show you how to fix this at the back half of the webinar.
Yeah, we're just listening at this point.
Yeah, that's crispy. Interesting. So Jim, Aaron chimed in and said this example sounds, actually it was the previous one, sounds more like a cut of lows than a boost of highs, which is an interesting observation because it can sound like that a lot of times. Your ear can trick you, but what you're looking at when you see this actual representation is Jim's screenshot of what he's actually applying EQ curve wise. So that's why it's so important to use your ears, but not let them trick you into thinking that you're backing down the lows.
Yeah, and another part about that is a good observation, is when you're boosting like this image here, when it shows somebody boosting those frequencies on a graphic equalizer, it's going to bring up the level of those frequencies. And so I don't blast everyone's ears. I had to compensate by bringing the overall level down after the boost. So it does sound like not only it really just sounds like we're cutting everything but the highs without, destroying everyone's hearing.
Right. Let's not destroy hearing on this.
Yeah, we don't want to destroy hearing.
So those were some examples. And so now you got to hear kind of a back and forth, but there are some really handy tools that can be used to fix this or prevent some of those horrible things from happening. And so Jim has some great examples to go through and actually correct what you were hearing in real time. Yeah.
And then before we go, okay, so yeah, we're going to cover the preamp, which is a super simple, it's usually if we're talking live sound, if you've ever used an analog mixing console, everything is set up on each channel strip in a certain order. And the preamp's always going to be the first thing. You set your level. And then there's probably like a high pass filter, an insert section, and then an EQ section would be the next thing. And then everything after the EQ in this list these would be outboard effects processors, the compressor and the noise gator dynamic processors, and the reverb's a time-based effect. So those would usually, those wouldn't be on a channel strip on an analog mixer, but now today with these digital mixers and everything, and digital audio workstations on computers, everything, it can be done without any other equipment. So we'll talk about that further as I try my best not to sound like an old man here. But yeah, EQ will be the first, preamp and EQ will be the first two things we cover, just because a lot of these examples are tonal changes. So we would use an EQ to fix a lot of those in the preamp, covering just the crunchy section. So if you could share my screen now. I don't have a live sound mixing console to show you for these examples, just because that would be difficult. But a lot of everything I touch here is available on like a digital mixing console or as an outboard effects processor. So very common tools here. And there's a lot more that I'm not going to cover. So if you have any questions about something I don't cover, feel free, please. Okay, so when we're talking about crunchy, this is a digital audio workstation, if you can see my screen here. And here's Laura's track. If I play that, and I'll bring this back up. If I literally just am dropping in effects here to make these sounds you were hearing. So with Crunchy, it's just a simple plugin that adjusts the volume. And really to fix it, this would be a preamp gain on a mixer. I could just bring the volume down. And then obviously, since I brought it down, I would bring up the fader on the live sound desk to send to the master bus to compensate for the change. But now it's not crunchy. So that's pretty straightforward as far as...
Make it a little... Sorry, Jim, can you make it a little louder so we can hear it?
I can.
Please. And make it more bigger, too.
So yeah, it would be as simple as turning down the preamp and adjusting level in other places like the fader, which would be at the bottom of a channel strip on a mixing console. So let's go back, and just so you get a better idea of what actually happens to the signal when you're clipping something, I'll apologize in advance for this, but I did this oscilloscope. I have just a simple oscilloscope plug-in, and I can drop in a tone generator. Let me see if you can hear that. Oh, it's muted. Hold on one second.
Yep.
Okay. And this is showing us the waveform that is capturing from that tone generator. And I'll use the same microphone, the same adjustment here.
I feel like my
and
hearing
I have
test, like raise your hand and hear it in your...
I lowered it so it wasn't quite as annoying.
It's great. It's great, actually. It's making sense.
Okay, so now we see this nice sine wave here, and that's what you're hearing. The max volume is set at -3 dB. So basically, this is going to start clipping at once I hit -3 on this oscilloscope. So I'm just going to bring this up slowly. You can probably hear it getting louder. But as soon as I hit that -3, it starts basically clipping the top and bottom of the waveform, and you can hear it. And the more I go, it basically turns from a nice sine wave to a square wave, and it no longer even sounds like that nice smooth tone we had a second ago. So that just gives you a nice visual representation on what's actually happening there. And it's obviously going to be a lot more complicated visually with a track like the acoustic guitar, but just to give you an idea of what kind of damage you can do by having the levels not set right. I think that's pretty useful. Okay, so moving on, beyond crunchy. So let's go to Boomy. And what I'm going to do now is go back to Laura's track, play those, and I'm just going to show you a simple, sorry for saying so much. This is a parametric EQ plugin, basically. So I will just go ahead and play that, put in this so you can hear it. And we'll see if we can...
You're multitasking, Jim, honestly.
I'm trying.
You're rocking it.
Thanks. Okay, so before I get into this and try to avoid a rant here, I think this filter I'm going to use is called a high pass filter for Boomy, and it's usually up by the preamp knob on a lot of analog consoles, and it's usually high up in the signal path on digital consoles too. And it's there for a reason. You can fix so much, you can clean up so much just by this one simple, in most cases, it's just a button. Just push that button. If we don't need all that low energy, if it's like an acoustic guitar, I don't need 50 hertz in an acoustic guitar. So, all right, rant over. Let me put this in, bring this back up so you can hear it, and we'll see if we can make this sound good. Okay, so my first filter, we're going to change this to a high pass and just bring it up. That was pretty easy. Here, let me get rid of this filter so you can hear Boomy again. That is a very easy way to fix a lot of Boomy or even muddy. This could go for muddy too. Let me show you. Now, one thing, you got to be careful with the high pass, because if it does allow you to sweep the frequency, we can also end up with a poor sound quality if we cut too much of the lows with this. And I'll show you.
And high pass and low cut are not the same thing, correct, Jim?
Sorry with my terminology there. Yeah, so a low cut, you'll hear different filters. In this case, it's a high pass filter. It's rolling off the low frequencies. And it worked basically I'll bring this down a little bit just so we can bring the muddiness back in. And instead of just using this for both examples, I'll use a high pass filter in conjunction with a low frequency filter. And now here's one more thing. This has it's very nice visually. It's giving me like an RTA readout on the screen. I can see what frequencies I'm cutting, exactly how wide the filter is. When on analog consoles, if you ever use one, you'll realize that doesn't exist. You just have a series of knobs, which basically forces you to use your ears. And I highly encourage that. Squiggly lines are cool and very helpful, but your ears are much better. And just don't let these if it doesn't look right, the EQ, if it sounds good, that's all that matters. So that doesn't require a whole lot to clean that up quite a bit. And again, this is really subjective. Some of you might be listening and thinking, oh, it's still a little muddy. Or some of you might think, oh, it's too thin now. So some people might think, hey, that sounds pretty good. So that's the whole issue with audio and how subjective it is. But again, this comes down to what you want to hear and how you want it to sound. So let's go beyond muddy and let's go to boxy. So now I'm probably gonna boxy the way it ended up reducing some of my low end. So I might just even remove the high pass filter altogether with this one. And another thing with these filters, the filter is basically, there's three variables with one of these EQ filters. It's the frequency, which is the frequency where you want to boost or cut. Then there's the gain, and that's how much you boost or cut it. And then there's the bandwidth, or also referred to as Q, and that's how wide, or that's how precise or how broad you want to get with this particular filter. And most multi-band parametric equalizers will have these adjustments on one or several of the filters depending on the layout of the console. 1 second. So let's start over because I wasn't able to listen here. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do first. One thing you can do if you're trying to correct it, or you're not sure exactly what frequency you're hearing, you can actually, instead of cutting it, you can boost it to try and dial that particular frequency in. And usually when you do that, I would probably bring the Q down so I'm not just boosting a wide range of frequencies. And this way we can kind of pinpoint. Sorry about that. What do you think, Laura?
Much more better.
Thank you.
No, I think it's great.
Okay, let's keep going here. How am I doing on time? We're doing okay?
Yeah.
So that was
some
boxy.
great questions in too. So looking
We
forward
got
to
some
answering those.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's take out boxy, put in nasally. What I was going to say earlier is there's a certain character on television when we were younger, depending on your age range, where one of the characters
ended up talking like this all the time, and that would be a good example of a nasally sounding individual.
Yes.
So let's go into that. Take this out. Okay, and if you didn't notice, when I engage this, when I just click this checkbox, it's putting it in line or not. So I'm basically disabling it when it's not checked. Okay, so we covered the low bass frequencies. You can fix a lot with a high pass filter, or just a combination of a high pass filter and a like a low frequency cut there with a, depending on how accurate you're trying to get or how precise the bandwidth. I've been going pretty wide with the bandwidth on these, but you can get pretty precise. So let's move on to bright, and we'll cover some more different types of filters besides just these individual filters we got going on here.
Do you have, Jim, on the bandwidth specifically, do you have a kind of guideline or general rule of thumb for how wide you would set it for a presenter? It's a very specific question, but I thought that was relevant.
So that's the thing is there's not. It depends on so many variables. The person's voice, the gain of it, how the mic was placed. All these different things are going to change tonally what should or shouldn't take place to make it more intelligible. So I would say start small. Start with a smaller bandwidth, and then move up from there. Or you could go the opposite. Everyone's going to have a different workflow, but the most important part is use your ears and listen to it. And when you start thinking about how wide or how narrow the bandwidth should be, you're going to start second guessing yourself. So it's just enable it, listen, disable it, listen again. Does it sound good? Yes. Cool. Have a friend listen to it. And yeah, it's really just, it comes down to what it sounds like. But I think with this, by default, it's right in the middle. So if you're using one that has a default setting, or it's usually like 12 o'clock on the knobs on a mixer, I would start there. And you can see that's pretty wide.
Yeah, that's real wide.
And I've been practicing these a bunch, so I'm kind of, if I was going into this blind, it might take me a little bit more trial and error to dial these in. Okay, that's a good question, though. I'm sorry I didn't totally answer it.
No, you did. You said it's subjective or depends on what you're doing. It's totally fair, but you gave a guideline, so.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
It depends. Best answer ever.
It depends, yeah.
Okay, now that I talked way too much here, let's go back to the audio. Okay, so this was bright. So in this case, instead of using an individual filter, I'm going to use a shelving filter. So it's not like a high pass or a low cut. This is going to be a filter. Here you can see it visually. So if I click on this fourth one here, there's a high shelf. And if I bring that down, you can see that it's basically going from 20K down and creating this shelf. So it's no longer like an individual notch. And this helps similarly without just getting rid of all the high end at a certain point like a low pass filter would do. This lets me gradually cut the higher frequencies. Oh, and I missed something here. Whether you boost or cut frequencies, so some folks might say, why don't, instead of cutting the high frequencies for bright, why don't you boost all the low energy to balance it out? It's, in live sound, especially, it's really difficult to boost particular frequencies or frequency ranges without making feedback become an issue really quick, especially the low frequencies. If you've ever heard like a large PA system begin to feedback, it's similar to like thunder happening really close, and it can be really damaging to not just folks' ears but also equipment and speakers and everything. So feedback's something you want to avoid. So cutting frequencies that are an issue versus giving or boosting frequencies that aren't necessarily there is what I would advise. Again, everything with audio is subjective, so you might hear it other ways.
So Jim, we got about 3 more minutes before we're going to move into Q&A. So anything else you wanted to...
Okay, let's go quicker. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so that would be a high shelf filter, and I was going to do the same thing for bright and sibilant. So let's just move on real quick to a compressor. Sorry, everybody, I got carried away. A compressor is a dynamic effect that lets, when there's a lot of dynamic range where something gets really quiet and really loud, and you want to kind of control that to let it stand above the mix in the live sound world, a compressor is really useful for that. So we'll see if you can hear this, but because I don't have a great example, but we'll just use Laura's guitar, and you can hear some dynamic variations after I take that out. Okay, and the way that the compressor works is you set a threshold, and once a signal hits that threshold as far as how loud it is, it will start to attenuate the signal. And the ratio determines how much it attenuates that signal. And then the attack and release, the attack is how fast it begins to attenuate it. The release is how slow or quickly it goes back to the normal level. And then once you'll hear this, it'll start to turn it down, and then you use the makeup gain to bring everything back up to a usable level. Had it bypassed. Okay, you can even get a visual here. You're hearing it turn down. The more I lower the threshold, the more it's gonna turn it down, because that's when it engages. And now that it's turned down and I've kind of controlled how loud it can get, I can use the makeup gain to bring it back up to an audible level. Okay, and then gate is the next one. I did a little vocal example with a white noise device running in the background here to give you a quick idea of how you use a gate. And this would be really helpful with drums and things where you want to basically remove as much of the audio as you can aside from the source you're trying to mic. So in this case, I just used my voice. A downward expander with a ratio setting of infinity to 1 becomes a noise gate. Now you can hear the signal level drops below the threshold. The output is essentially turned off or gated, also preventing buildup of undesired noises. The audible effect of a noise gate can be, and with a gate, it's also a dynamic effects processor. So basically, it's going to attenuate the signal unless the threshold where how loud it gets, unless it gets a certain loudness, I guess, or unless it gets loud to the point where you set the threshold, it is going to keep the gate closed. So once the audio is loud enough to open the gate, the audio passes through. And how quickly the gate opens and how long the gate, the attack tells you how quickly the gate opens. The hold is how long the gate stays open. And then the release is how quickly the gate closes. So let's just listen real quick. It's really obvious. And I'll just try to use this to reduce the background noise as much as I can. Also preventing buildup of undesired noises. The audible effect of a noise gate can be somewhat more disturbing than a downward expander, since the transition to the off state is more abrupt, audibly similar to manually muting or unmuting an audio channel. And you can hear downward expander. It's funny because you can hear the when I'm talking and the gate's open, of course, you're going to hear that. And maybe I would use EQ or something to try and get rid of some of that after the gate. But at least between the points where I'm talking, you would not get any audio going through. Same with a rack tom, for example. Threshold, the output is essentially turned off or gated, also preventing buildup of undesired noises. Okay. Very helpful for a lot of different applications when you're trying to clean it up and reduce as much background noise as possible. Okay, last thing is reverb. Threshold, the output is essentially... And reverb is really good at adding depth. If you have a sound that's very dead or very, I guess, if you want to add some liveliness or you want it to give it depth or a feel like it's in a room, you can use reverb for that. And this is pretty over the top. But a lot of reverb units have different presets like plates and halls and chambers that you can easily use and then kind of change the decay time or the pre-delay and things like that. If you're a guitar player, you're probably pretty familiar with the spring reverb in a lot of amplifiers. So it's a really cool effect, and it really adds a lot of, it really livens up a mix really quick. And you can hear that here. This is pretty over the top. Okay, my computer's kind of glitching out on me here, so let's just stop that. So yeah, reverb is a really good tool to liven it up, give it a depth, or make it feel like it's in a room, and you can basically tell it what kind of room you want it to be in. So that's the tools you would typically use. Those are probably the most common tools. EQ being the one I covered the most, just because you don't need all these plugins or effects processors to make something sound pretty good. And a lot of times you just need a high pass filter and adjust the gain properly. So there we go. Sorry I was rushed there at the end. That's my bad.
Nah, it's okay. We had a lot to cover in like no time, but we have tons of great questions. Cheryl, I am going to let you jump in and guide the way there so we can stop sharing Jim's screen and go to the good stuff here. Even more good stuff.
Awesome. Nice job, guys. It's really funny you talk about wanting to spend more time on it. Somebody mentioned that we should just do an all-day virtual session on going through all of this, or we could even do a separate session on each of these sections, and how to fix them and all of that. So lots of good stuff there. Let me try and get myself centered here on my...
I know, it's jarring.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, we had quite a few questions, but a few were slightly off topic, so I'm going to kind of stick to the ones on topic, and then if we have time, we'll go into the ones that were a little bit on the fringe. So be patient. We'll try to get through as many as we can, everybody. First question, you kind of touched on it, but I think we need a little bit of clarification. Can you kind of talk about... high pass and low cut, are those the same thing? What's the difference between the two? Can you just kind of clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so a high pass filter would be like, I don't know if you can see my screen now, but what I showed here. And a high pass filter is basically, here, let me bring this up. You'll see it a lot on, it'll look like a little button. And basically, it basically would just look like this. Even a lot of our microphones have them built in to the mic. You can engage them with a little switch, and that helps so much without even needing to engage it on the desk. So a high pass filter is basically rolling off everything below a certain frequency. And a low cut, I guess, wouldn't really be like a high pass like a filter like that. A low cut would probably be closer to a low shelf, or even just an individual cut like I showed earlier. So a low shelf would be like this, where it shelves off. Instead of cutting the entire portion below that point, it rolls it off gradually to where it levels out if you bring it over enough here. So the difference between a high pass and a low cut, I guess it depends on who you ask, but a high pass is going to be the best for getting rid of a lot of low frequencies easily without affecting anything above it.
Okay.
I hope I answered the question there.
Yep.
So it's tricky, but yeah. Next question, what slope do you recommend for a high pass filter?
Okay, so that's a great question. So with a high pass filter, if we look at this, let me get rid of this one. The slope is how, this would come into how precise you want it to be. If you want it to gradually roll off the lows, you could make this, depending on the filter itself. If we wanted to slowly roll them off, we could adjust the slope so we're kind of gradually getting rid of that low end energy, where we're not just at, what frequency am I at here? Where we're not just at 330 hertz, putting like a brick wall and cutting off everything below that, where it's nice and gradual, it's smoother. So again, it's one of those things where it depends. If you're trying to EQ a kick drum, obviously you want those bass frequencies, but there might be certain frequencies below a certain point, like 50 hertz or lower, where you don't want it to really be gradual. You want to just try and remove as much energy as possible. In those scenarios, you would make the slope tighter. So it just depends on it. Where if it was like trying to think of a good example, maybe a piano or something where you're not necessarily wanting a wall behind that frequency, where you want it to be more gradual, that would be an example. It kind of just depends on what you're working on.
Okay.
Nice.
All right. Every venue has an acoustic signature with certain resonances. Can you determine this without performances and pre-adjust accordingly? And how much do you think an audience or people would change that in the room?
That really depends on the room. So if you've ever been to a concert in like an arena, for example, an arena is not designed to hold concerts in, really. It's just convenient because it's a large space with a lot of seating. It's typically used for basketball or hockey or something like that. And when you throw all these hard surfaces in with a really tall roof or ceiling that's probably made out of metal and like steel beams, and we have concrete, and the floor is an ice hockey rink covered with plywood, I mean, that's got a lot of reflective surfaces. So that makes it really difficult to determine something like that, because when you are doing a sound check or something, you don't want to overcompensate for the amount of resonance in a room, because as soon as it fills up with people, it's going to deaden everything down, and then you're going to have to go back and correct your mix. So everyone does it differently. Some folks will go into a room, you'll see them like walk around and start clapping, and listen, and that'll give you an idea. But when human bodies get into the room, it's going to deaden everything down quite a bit. So and that's where you would probably bring some reverb back to give it more depth. So that can have a big impact on it. While some venues like theaters are designed in a way to acoustically, move energy away from the performance area out into the audience. And those kind of situations are depending on what it's designed for. So like if it's an outdoor venue designed for an orchestra and they did not have a PA system in mind when they designed it, it's probably going to be pretty reverberant. So you'll have to compensate for that, even with humans in there. So it really depends on the room, and it's unless you've been to a place a lot of times, it's really hard to know exactly what the impacts are going to be. So you kind of get into, it's an experience thing, I guess. It depends. I'm just going to use this word for every single one. I'm sorry.
I mean, it always kind of applies. There's always factors that, are going to be different in every room. So yeah, it does depend.
It's definitely something you want to think about.
Mm-hmm. Next question is about sort of wind noise. Mixing an outdoor setting, mainly for speech, but with some music and singing. When the wind picks up, I get a lot of roaring noise, even with the standard foam cover on a lavalier mic. I started using a fairly deep but narrow, about 150 hertz wide low-pass filter in the 200 to 400 hertz range till at least most of the wind noise was gone, but was not overly affecting the speech quality as much. Do you recommend this or another approach?
So yeah, wind noise is tricky. It depends on the mic, but wind noise is going to introduce things across the audible spectrum. So you'll hit the rumble and the low frequencies. So I would start with a high pass filter. And again, it's hard for me to say, do exactly this at this slope when the mixer you get or whatever you're using at the time might not have that capability. It might just have a high pass filter button. and it might be fixed at like 80 or 120 hertz. So in those cases, you got to use the tools you have at your disposal. So the first thing I would start with wind noise is a high pass filter. And then there's also going to be, it's hard to describe the sound, but there is going to be some more high end energy depending on how the wind's hitting the microphone capsule itself. So yeah, you can use some narrower notches up higher to kind of compensate for that if you have that available at your disposal. But yeah, you want to do as much as you can without destroying or I guess impacting it to the point where it's not intelligible.
All right. Sorry, I have to get my windows square here. Next question. How do you know when to change the ratio when using a compressor?
That's a good question. I usually start pretty low. It just depends on the dynamic range of what you have mic'd. So a vocalist, Laura can probably touch on this. So a vocalist with a lot of experience will have really good mic technique, where if they're getting louder, they'll move the microphone further from their mouth, or if they're going to do some more quiet things, they'll put it closer. And a compressor can help control that. And depending on how much it's changing, it is going to determine what the ratio you're going to want to use. And it's going to be completely different with live sound than it is in like a recording studio, because some folks might use a compressor as a tool to control the dynamic range, but some folks might like the way the compressor colors the sound and things like that. Laura, do you want to touch on that at all, being a vocalist?
Well, I mean, and Cheryl is as well. But in terms of specific to the ratio, I'm not sure I can speak to that. But I will say that when you are in the studio, a compressor can be your best friend or your worst enemy. It needs to be used in moderation. So I think getting the ratio to be blended to where it's not overcompensating or hitting the attack too hard is what I've usually found to be effective. But that's just for my personal instrument. So yeah, compression can help to bring things up, but can often be overused in certain genres of music. So
if the ratio
tastefully.
Oh, sorry for cutting you off there. This delay's kind of messing with me. Hey, the ratio also, what happens if you're overcompensating, you'll begin to hear, it's almost like pumping. You probably heard it referred to as pumping, where
which is
you'll
an
hear
effect that some love to use. Not this kid.
Yeah.
It is an effect, actually.
Yeah, if you want it to be subtle, like when I'm mixing, I want things to be as transparent as possible, and that's kind of what I'm going towards. I'd probably try to use it to control the dynamic range to a point where I can get it to sit nicely in the mix, and it's not constantly coming above or going below the level of everything else in the mix. But also, I don't personally want to hear it, especially when it comes to live sound.
Okay, I think we can kind of verge over to some of the fringe questions. Since we're a little over time. Are you guys still good to keep going?
Yep.
Yes, I'm seeing a nod. All right, sounds good. All right, we'll keep going. So sort of the fringe questions. What's the difference between the MV7 and the SM7B? And I would say maybe also we might want to tack on the newest MV7X as well. Can Laura, maybe you kind of describe the differences between those?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry if my feed is a little bit delayed. So the SM7B is the oldest of the three, and it's the legend. It is not the same as the MV7 or MV7X. It is specifically tailored for, well, actually, I should say it's not specifically tailored. You can use it on many different things, but it is a dynamic microphone, as well as the MV7 and MV7X. The MV7 is a USB XLR hybrid microphone, and it's a dynamic mic as well. The MV7X is the XLR only variant of the MV7, which is what I'm using today. And those are geared towards content creators, podcasting, streamers. And the SM7B is made to be kind of like the broadcast professional option for those looking to improve their professional setup. So if you're looking for something that's not going to really involve a lot of extraneous pieces of gear, the MV7 is a perfect choice for you because it has that ability to go straight in via USB. You can control the DSP processing of the microphone directly on the mic or using our Shure Plus desktop app. So it's basically kind of a use case scenario, and all three of those mics are going to be great in untreated rooms like this one, good at blocking out extraneous noise, echo, or, poor acoustic treatment. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, the great thing about the MV7 specifically is that you can expand from a USB to an XLR or utilize both of those outputs at the same time. So something to think about there.
Hey, I'm seeing a good comment I want to add to here. I don't know if I can call out individuals, but going back to the high pass, low cut, somebody said high pass is low cut. They're synonyms. You're cutting off frequencies below a certain point. Shelving does not cut frequencies. Okay, so thank you for that correction. And then there you go. That's a pretty good bit of information there. And my apologies. I'm nervous.
It's not like you don't have a lot of things you're trying to juggle right now, Jim.
Right.
It's okay.
Just want to make sure the right
poster
information
behind
is getting
you.
out there to everybody.
Look at your poster, Jim, for inspo. You'll be fine. Hang in
Just
there.
hang in there, buddy. There. Okay, we have another MV7 question. This person is using an MV7 USB with GarageBand for a podcast. The volume is low and the sibilance is high. They changed the windscreen and added a pop filter, but it's still a bit harsher than they would like. Any suggestions?
Yes, absolutely. So using the MV7, first thing I would say, check your firmware to make sure you're using the current update. You can do that within that Shure Plus desktop app. But you can also adjust it. I'm not sure if you're using it in manual or auto level mode. Auto level mode has 3 tonal presets, dark, normal, and bright. So you can try to adjust that to address your sibilance if you don't really want to get under the hood. But if you do put it in manual mode, then you can adjust your EQ settings and your compression as well to kind of back that off. In terms of level, if you're using it, I'm sorry, what was the platform, Cheryl? Did they mention which platform they're using?
GarageBand.
Oh, GarageBand. Okay, so it's not going to be adjusting your auto gain. Like sometimes if you're using it on Teams or Zoom, you can fall victim to it manually adjusting your gain and jumping all over the place. But auto level mode actually negates that completely. But in GarageBand, volume is low, sibilance is high, change the windscreen. What you can do when you're saying sibilance, if you're talking about pops and plosives, what you can do is what I'm doing right now, instead of speaking into it directly and having plosives, you can just turn a little bit off axis so that your mouth is not pointing directly at the mic. And that can address the sibilance and plosive issues as well. But in terms of gain or volume, also make sure if you're monitoring directly from the back of the MV7 using headphones that you're not missing the ability to turn up your headphone level, which you can do directly on the mic itself. So just by tapping that button that looks like a mic/headphones to where your LEDs are orange, that'll actually adjust your headphone level. So a couple things to try. Hopefully that gets you there.
Awesome. And if that doesn't help, you can always go to shure.com/contact. And at that site, there is a form you can fill out to open up a ticket with our support team, and they can help dig in a little bit more with you. So shure.com/contact, great place for any questions you may have. And I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up with one last question that's actually for me, and that is this going to be available for on-demand viewing? Yes, it will be. We need to decide as a team how we're going to kind of maybe edit it in post, clean some things up for you all. But it will be available if you did register. We will send an email to you letting you know that it's available. If you didn't, it will be available here on the YouTube page. You can also go to shure.com/webinars. That is a great place to go for all of our past, current, and future webinars. So we do have our webinar archives listed there as well. That's shure.com/webinars. And I think we're a little over time, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. But I just want to thank Laura and Jim for all their great information today. I think we could have gone on for hours and hours, but we all have things to do. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you learned something. I know I sure did. And we will see you on the next one. Bye.